All right, everyone. Welcome to the 245 question and answer with Park Historian Jim Ogden. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time to the 157th anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga. We're doing most of our programming, well, all of our programming, virtually. We do have some rangers at a tent at the information desk providing information to visitors as they walk up to the visitor center. But as far as Jim Ogden's programs out in the field and the ranger programs that we have out in the field, we're going to be doing those all virtually this year. So please take those in the rest of the afternoon today. We have one at 4 o'clock and one at 8 o'clock. And then tomorrow we'll be starting at 7 a.m. at Glass Mill, which is off the currently preserved property at Chickamauga Battlefield. So the way this works, if you haven't joined us already for previous Q&As with Ogden, is you can ask questions at any time. So if you want to go ahead and start rolling those questions in on Facebook or on YouTube Live, you're more than welcome to do that. We will ask Jim those questions live, and then he will answer those here. We're sitting now in one of the rooms, one of the offices here in the operations building at Chickamauga Battlefield. In this room, we have a painting behind us of Snodgrass Hill, and one of the guns, one of the cannon of the 4th U.S. Artillery there, and we're flanked by two of the bookshelves that we have here in the room. So get those questions rolling in, and without further ado, you didn't come to listen to me ask questions or to ramble on. Here's Park Historian Jim Ogden. Jim?
Thank you, Chris. And for those of you all who have joined us on earlier programs yesterday or today, the question and answer sessions, welcome back. For those of you all who might just be joining us for the first time, thank you for tuning in. And all of you, thank you for participating this year virtually in the National Military Park's recognition of the anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga, 157th anniversary. And this year, as hopefully many of you all recognize, the days of the battle, September 18, 19, and 20, fall on the same days of the week as they did in 1863.
All right, Jim. Well, let's get this started off. We're going to answer two questions that came into us earlier after our 1045 session, and we just didn't get to those during the live session, but some visitors did write those to us afterwards. First off, the question is, does one of John Morton's bullpups sit in front of the visitor center at Chickamauga Battlefield?
Most commonly, the guns that are identified as forest bullpups and amongst the guns that were in John Morton's battery, particularly when he was associated with Nathan Bedford Forest Command, are 3-inch ordnance rifles. Morton's battery or forest artillery here did include mountain howitzers and also mountain rifles, an even more obscure light gun of the Civil War. But none of the guns that are identified as forest bullpups are here at this National Military Park. There are 3-inch ordnance rifles here, but not any that are forest bullpups specifically. And in fact, if you read John Morton's history of forest artillery carefully, you will see that Morton says that Forrest called lots of his guns bullpups. So it's almost a more general term than specific.
Thanks, Jim. The other question that came in after the 1045 session was, did Alexander's Bridge actually get totally destroyed, or was it able to be used to some extent?
When John Thomas Wilder's Brigade of Mounted Infantry arrived at Alexander's on September the 17th, they took the wooden flooring of the bridge, the actual road surface of the bridge, up to disable it, to make it more of an obstacle to cross. and they piled those planks up on the west side of the creek. There is no indication that I have seen that that bridge had been previously been disabled in any way by the retreating Confederates. Although that is perhaps a possibility, since Reed's Bridge, just a couple of miles to the north of there, had been had the planks taken off of it by the Confederates as they retreated south. So once Wilder was forced to retreat from the area of Alexander's Bridge on the late afternoon of September the 18th, the Confederates come to possess that whole area, and they're able to put the planks back down on the bridge. It's another reflection of Wilder thinking more broadly, doing staff rides for military groups today. I frequently will take a group down to Alexander Bridge, and we'll talk about Wilder's defense of that crossing. And I'll describe the wooden bridge that would have been there at the time. And I'll ask my participants, I'll say, what would you do to the bridge if you were tasked with defending this crossing? And particularly when the group is younger and lower graded leaders, the immediate answer is, I'd blow it. But then you potentially would remove that asset from your suite of things that you could use. And Wilder essentially did the same thing. He didn't take the time to chop the bridge down. He didn't have good explosives to potentially blow the bridge up. He also didn't pile combustibles on it to set it on fire and burn it. But by taking the planks up off of it, he at least disabled it and made it more of an obstacle for the Confederates. And should it been the case that he could have used the bridge again, just put the planks back down on it. So.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate that. One of the other questions that came in is that are the tablets for John K. Jackson's brigade and the Georgia markers for the 1st Georgia correctly placed on the battlefield today?
In general, I would say yes, they are. The majority of the commemorative features for Jackson's brigade are in the immediate area where they were engaged. Particularly for the 19th, they are primarily arrayed along the crest of the low rise that is crossed by Alexander Bridge Road on the north side and Brotherton Road on the south side. And if you walk from Alexander Bridge Road, if you park at the John Ingram grave site and walk the trail south, you will walk along the rise of ground along which the Jackson's brigade fought and find the markers for those units that have markers. Of course, the Mississippi units, the state of Mississippi did not erect monuments or markers here. They are not marked in any way other than on the tablet for the brigade, but you'll find the marker for Scoggins, Georgia Battery, the Church Bell Battery, and the 5th Georgia along that line, as well as the 1st Confederate, which, being heavily Georgia, is often confused as being a Georgia unit, but it's actually one of the few units of the regular Confederate Army.
Where exactly was Thomas Hindman on the 19th, on this day?
Hindman's division, as part of Polk's Corps, had been tasked in Bragg's plan to march up from the south, and they'll come up from the Lafayette beginning on the 17th and then continuing on the 18th. And Polk's Corps and Hill's Corps on the 18th are to confront Federals across West Chickamauga Creek from Lee and Gordon's Mill southward. And right east of Lee and Gordon's Mill on the 18th will be Cheatham's division. Hindman's division, having come up the road, will be operating from the Henderson farm across Clarissa Hunt's farm. What is the Huntland farm? The Clarissa Hunt house still stands today there between the current alignment of the Lafayette Road and the historic alignment, what's known as Tom Hunt Road today. But they'll skirmish with Federals on the west side of West Chickamauga Creek, just upstream of Lee and Gordon's Mill there during the course of the 18th, and do that again on the 19th. And only late on the 19th will they be ordered to march north and come onto the battlefield by fording West Chickamauga Creek at Dalton or Hunt's Ford, and then marching northward towards the sound of the action. And they'll be getting into position as the action dies down on September the 19th, being located just north of the Vineyard Field area.
Thanks, Jim. One of the other questions that we have is how far could locals hear the battle? What's the maximum distance that you would give, or that you may have read primarily, that you could actually hear the reverberations of the battle?
There are accounts from people who lived in or about Rome, Georgia, which is about 50 airline miles to the south, and also over another significant terrain feature, Taylor's Ridge. But they could hear the battle. The advance element of Burnside's force, which had occupied Knoxville and was sweeping Confederates out of East Tennessee. The southernmost advanced element of that force, Robert Byrd's brigade, is on the Hiwassee River, and they'll withdraw on northward as well, having had a little engagement in Cleveland on the 18th. But they can hear the battle, and that's 35 miles or so to the northeast. So the sound of this battle carried very greatly. And the terrain probably does something to help channel that sound as well. As you may have had some experiences yourself, Chris, participating in artillery demonstrations that we have done. Sometimes even today, even with just one cannon shot, and with all of the ambient noise of traffic and all kinds of other things, particularly when you're up on Missionary Ridge and there are artillery demonstrations being done, it's kind of interesting to hear where you can hear the sound from those demonstrations. I think that the terrain, those northeast to southwest ridge lines help to channel it some as well.
So another person has asked, are there burial pits, or were there burial pits on Chickamauga battlefield as a result of the deaths here?
Well, burial here was really heavily affected by the fact that the Confederates controlled the battlefield at the end of the battle. And that, by and large, allowed Confederate units to go back over the battlefield where those units had been engaged and recover the dead of their unit. They then, in most cases, seemingly from the soldier accounts that we have and other sources, those units then buried their dead in one place. Now, that term burial pit often is misleading because sometimes these unit burials were not individual graves located a few feet apart from one another, but because of a shortage of tools and time, the nature of the soil here, the amount of labor involved, some of the graves that were open for unit burials were actually intended to be a group burial to begin with. They would open one grave and place the bodies in the grave in a particular order, marking them in some fashion. The quartermaster of the 30th Tennessee records in his diary that in addition to burying the soldiers in the one grave side by side in the order that he names, they reverse the body's head and foot in the grave. Both, since most of us are narrower at the feet than we are at the shoulder, both to save space, to reduce the amount of digging that was necessary, but also, he said, to assist in the potential recovery of those remains by family members or comrades later. By reversing the body's head and foot, it would be clear that you have gotten all of the remains of one individual. So we don't, the 30th Tennessee is the only account where we have that level of specificity by reversing the body's head and foot, although that may have been done a number of times. By and large, from accounts of the battlefield in the days and weeks after, the Confederates got their dead buried in some identifiable fashion. They gave rudimentary burial to the Union dead on the battlefield, and in most cases, that was scooping earth up from either side of the set of Union remains, piling the earth on that set of Union remains, and then leaving it. Well, the decomposition of the human body with bloating would begin to push some of that earth off. And then late on September the 30th, it began to rain heavily and will rain 19 of the next 53 days. And that will wash more of the dirt off. So much so that by the time federal soldiers can come back to the battlefield in late November and early December, they find the remains of their dead partially or largely exposed from the earth being washed off of those bodies. And George Thomas, learning of the situation, actually will send troops out to get the Union remains buried better. And this is where the common idea of a burial pit is really more applicable to the Chickamauga battlefield. Even though those Union soldiers are being sent out here to bury the remains of their fallen comrades, this is a disagreeable job for these mostly 18 to 25-year-olds. And as much as they may have wanted to be more respectful, getting the job done was a pressure on them. Getting a disagreeable job done was a pressure on them. And they, in a number of areas, will open large graves, depressions, pits, and will then drag all of the nearby partially decomposed, partially exposed sets of Union remains into that pit, jumbling them together. And it's those burials by other Union soldiers in typically early December where that phrase burial pit is most applicable.
Well, and if I can just interject from behind the camera, I think that if our viewers were to get their hands on a copy of the 78th Illinois, Carter Van Vleck's, Lieutenant Colonel of the 78th Illinois, writes his wife about his best friend, who's the major, William Broadus, who is killed here. And he mentions this burial pit as they're trying to find Major Broadus's remains to be sent back to Macomb, Illinois. And if you're able to get your hands on that, on Van Vleck's writings to his wife, or even on those to Broadus's wife, I think that would open your eyes up a little bit to having those Union soldiers coming back, and it's them who's actually doing the burial pits, and then just what it took to try to identify those remains. And Van Vleck goes into some pretty explicit details about what they find. So I would take a look at that and try to pick that up somewhere if you can. Going on that real quick, Jim, is a question about the livestock on the battlefield. As we've talked about, and as you talked about in your previous video about the open forested landscape and talking about branding or notching the livestock that are out there on the field, what happens to them? What happens to the livestock that are caught here? What happens to the horses that are pulling the artillery pieces or ammunition wagons or officers' horses or cavalry horses like forest men when those horses become deaths on the battlefield? What happens to them days and weeks and months after?
During the actual days of the battle, September 18, 19, 20, you see really no references by soldiers to open range livestock as was common. However, on September the 17th, 16th, 15th, in the days before and after the battle, you do see those references. So I think one thing is farmers may well have tried to shoo some of their animals off. Then you also have to remember that Bragg's army has been camped in the Chattanooga area since early July, and even even with Southern sympathizing citizens in the area, not all of Bragg's soldiers were too worried about whether or not a given free-range pig or cow was the property of a Union sympathizer or a Confederate sympathizer. And so the farmers' livestock had already been pretty heavily preyed upon by hungry Confederate soldiers even before the time of the battle. Also, Confederate quartermasters and commissary officers would have been buying livestock to feed the army. So there are a number of reasons why you don't really see references to livestock immediately in the battle. But there probably were some that may well have become casualties and maybe dinner or breakfast very quickly. But during the course of the action, many horses, both officers' horses and then artillery horses, will become casualties as well. And given the population density here, the devastation of the battlefield, you don't really see, as you do on some other battlefields in the Civil War, you don't really see much discussion about any effort to clear the remains of those dead horses. The majority of them probably just simply rotted away. When Confederate President Jefferson Davis is given a tour of the battlefield on October the 12th, there is the account of Davis coming upon the carcass of an animal that obviously had to have been an officer's animal based on the apparent value of the animal. And he asked, whose horse was this? And he was told that it was William B. Bates' horse. Rides on a short distance, and there's another horse, not quite of the same quality. He asks whose horse that is. He's told that it's Bates' horse. He rides further. There's another horse he asks, and he's told that is Bates' horse as well. Bates had 3 animals in succession shot out from under him. So, assuming that account is largely accurate, in mid-October, 3 weeks after the battle, there are still recognizable carcasses of horses on the battlefield. And again, with the limited population density here to begin with, and in cases like the snodgrasses, who we know from family histories don't really live back on the battlefield until after the war, there just weren't the people around to do the labor to do such things as take care of the carcasses of the horses.
Just real quick too, to hopefully we'll get off of kind of the more I would say morbid, but we are talking about a battle too. So we can't really get away from it entirely. But going back to the burial pits, are there any? Someone asked, are there any still on the battlefield or identified on the battlefield, such as they are at Shiloh?
Right. There are not any identifiable unit burial graves or of the burial pits. Now, archaeologically, it may be possible to discover some of those if we had good enough accounts, and in some cases we probably are at least pretty close to it. Having good enough accounts to identify the likely area of some, and then use the appropriate archaeological techniques, we may be able to delineate where some of them were located. But unlike some other places in the Civil War where former grave sites are still identifiable, or like at Shiloh, the Confederate burial pits being identifiable, we don't know specifically of the location of any of them here. However, I think that is something that could possibly be done. One of the telltales of that would not only potentially be some of the artifacts like uniform buttons, but also there is plenty of evidence from both the large-scale reburials in the immediate post-Civil War period and subsequently that in probably the vast majority of the cases of reburials, the reburials were not done so thoroughly as to ensure the retrieval from the grave of all of the human remains. And lots of former Civil War soldier presence of particularly hand and finger and foot and toe bones in the grave, those smaller bones being very easily overlooked. And that's just another example of how we really need to consider the entire battlefield here, not just as hallowed ground, as a historic site, but also as a burial site, as a grave. In many ways, not unlike the National Cemetery or say a Confederate cemetery where large numbers of Confederate soldiers from a given battle are buried. And in this case, it'd be the Marietta Confederate Cemetery. The likelihood that there are still soldiers, human remains out here on this ground is very high. And as some recent archaeological work on the Franklin battlefield has shown, where the preservation, acquisition of some property that had structures on them for many years, where those structures were removed, it was discovered that the bottom part of the Union Trench survives. And as the archaeologists excavated that trench, they came upon large numbers of human bone fragments, teeth, as these 1 ounce, in most cases, lead mini balls passed through a soldier. They shattered bone very badly. And many of those small bone pieces were driven out of the soldier's body. That's the case with John Bell Hood when he is wounded here on September the 20th as well. And those bone pieces then fell to the ground and were identifiable to the archaeologist just a couple of years ago. So.
Thanks, Jim. I think that we're gonna wrap this up with one last question that was asked a little earlier. So, where was the 17th Tennessee engaged on the battlefield on the 19th of 1863?
The 17th Tennessee, as part of Johnson's brigade, then under the command of John Fulton of the 44th Tennessee, they will attack with Johnson's division on the afternoon of the 19th, and will attack kind of northwestward from their starting position along a low rise of ground that runs north and south of Alexander Vineyard Road, near where the gate and parking area is today for going down to Dalton and Thegford's Ford. You walk just a little bit further east from there, and then go north along a trail that'll take you past the guns for Culpeper's South Carolina battery, or the tablet for Culpeper, South Carolina battery, and the marker for Everett's or York's battery. The 17th Tennessee started along that line a little bit further to the north, and then would attack northwestward. And will it be engaged against mostly King's Federal Brigade. And so you could also walk south from Brotherton Road along the major trail, past where you would turn to go to the Carnes Battery site, and go on down and find the markers for Dick's Brigade, and then just beyond them, the markers for Ed King's Brigade. And the 17th Tennessee is engaged with them.
I appreciate it, Jim. Thank you all for asking these great questions this afternoon, and keep any questions you have in the back of your mind, and you can ask them again tomorrow. We'll have programs, as I said, starting again at 7 a.m. At Glass Mill. Then we'll have Jim back at 10 a.m. In the morning, following the morning portion of September the 20th's attacks. And then at 10:45 in the morning, we'll have another Q&A with Jim Ogden. And so keep those questions for anything that's happening in the morning, the 7 o'clock, his 10 o'clock program, or any of the other questions that you may not have been able to ask him today. Keep those jotted down so that you can ask Jim tomorrow morning at 10:45. Thank you all, and thanks, Jim, for being here this afternoon.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for tuning in as well.